Hanwoo stood at the window of the Earth Embassy, looking out at the 3 moons of Valeria hanging in the purple sky. His fingers drummed against the crystal walls, creating tiny echoes in the otherwise silent room. The message he had received that morning still played in his mind. Earth needed this alliance, and he was the key to securing it. Behind him, Ambassador Lee cleared her throat. The Valerian High Council has made their terms clear. They will only sign the peace treaty if we can unite our peoples through marriage. Princess Era needs a husband, and you're our most qualified diplomat. Hanwoo turned from the window, his reflection rippling across the crystal surface. He had seen images of Princess Era. Everyone had. Her gray skin lacked the pearl-like sheen that marked Valerian beauty, and her features seemed almost human-like, which the Valerians saw as deeply flawed. They say she spends all her time in the science archives, Ambassador Lee continued, her voice softer now. She's never attended a single royal gathering. The Valerians whisper that she hides away because she knows how different she looks. Hanwoo picked up the crystal tablet from his desk, studying Princess Era's image again. Where others saw ugliness, he noticed something else, a subtle glow beneath her gray skin, like starlight through clouds. Her eyes held intelligence and perhaps a hint of sadness. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Then the Valerians will likely ally with the Drekon Empire instead." Ambassador Lee's words hung heavy in the air. Earth cannot survive being caught between 2 crystal-based empires. We need their technology, their resources. Hanwoo walked to his desk and sat down, remembering his childhood in the countryside of Earth. His grandmother had always told him that true beauty lived in actions, not appearances. She would tell him stories of plain flowers that produced the sweetest honey, of rough stones that held precious gems inside. A soft chime announced another visitor. General Park from Earth's Defense Force. "The Drekon ships are moving closer to our outer colonies," he reported grimly. "We need this alliance, Hanwoo. Millions of lives depend on it." Hanwoo looked at Princess Era's image one final time. Beyond her gray skin and asymmetrical features, he noticed how she held herself in the photo, slightly turned away, as if trying to hide, yet her eyes showed determination. She was carrying the same burden he was, perhaps even a heavier one. "Tell the Valerian High Council I accept their proposal," Hanwoo said quietly. "But I have one condition. I want to meet Princess Era in the science archives, where she feels most comfortable, not in some formal royal setting." Ambassador Lee's eyes widened. "That's unusually thoughtful. The Valerians might actually approve of such consideration." As his superiors left to relay his decision, Hanwoo remained at his desk, watching the 3 moons rise higher in the alien sky. He thought about Princess Era, hidden away in her crystal archives, perhaps dreading this arrangement as much as he had been. But now, strangely, he felt curious rather than reluctant. He activated his computer and began researching Valerian scientific achievements. If Princess Era loved science so much, perhaps that was the bridge they needed, not just between themselves, but between their peoples. As he read about crystal technology and quantum mechanics, Hanwoo realized this marriage might be more than just a diplomatic transaction. A message flashed across his screen. The Valerian High Council had agreed to his condition. In 3 days, he would meet his future wife in the Great Archive of Valeria. Hanwoo closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Somewhere in those crystal spires, a princess was probably doing the same thing, both of them stepping onto a path that would change not just their lives, but the future of their peoples. The fate of Earth rested on his ability to see beyond the surface, to find common ground with someone the universe had deemed unlovable. As he prepared for bed that night, Hanwoo smiled slightly. His grandmother would have said this was exactly the kind of situation where true beauty had a chance to bloom. Outside his window, the 3 moons of Valeria cast their light across the crystal city, creating rainbows that danced across the walls. Tomorrow would bring challenges, but tonight, Hanwoo felt strangely at peace with his decision. Sometimes, he thought, The most important choices in life came disguised as impossible ones. The crystal spires of the great archive towered around Hanwoo as he walked through its quiet halls. His footsteps echoed softly against the translucent floor, each step sending tiny ripples of light through the crystal structure. He had arrived early, hoping to calm his nerves before meeting Princess Era. He found her in the quantum mechanics section, surrounded by floating holographic displays showing complex equations. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her gray skin caught the light differently than other Valerians. Instead of reflecting it like polished pearl, it seemed to absorb and softly release it, creating a subtle glow that reminded him of Earth's dawn. "Princess Ara," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and Hanwoo saw her eyes for the first time. They were a deep violet, like the Valerian night sky. She didn't try to hide her face as he had expected. Instead, she looked directly at him with open curiosity. "You're early," she said, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "And you came to the archives instead of requesting a formal meeting room. That's different." "I heard this was where you felt most at home," Hanwoo replied honestly. "It seemed right to meet you here." A small smile touched her lips as she gestured to the displays around them. "I was just reviewing some theories about deep space folding. Earth has made remarkable progress in this field, especially considering you don't have access to crystal technology." Hanwoo stepped closer, examining the equations. "These are Professor Kim's theories on quantum tunneling, aren't they? I didn't know Valerians studied Earth science." "We study everything," Era said, her eyes lighting up. "The universe is too vast and wonderful to ignore any source of knowledge." She waved her hand, and the displays rearranged themselves. "Look at this. I've been combining Earth's theories with Valerian crystal resonance patterns." For the next hour, they lost themselves in discussion. Era explained how crystal technology could enhance Earth's existing space travel methods, while Hanwoo shared insights about practical applications they hadn't considered. He found himself forgetting about appearances entirely, caught up in her brilliant mind and passionate explanations. "You're not what I expected," Era said suddenly, during a pause in their conversation. "Most people see me and only think about the treaty, or they can't look past." She gestured to her gray skin. "Most people aren't looking properly," Hanwoo replied. "They miss how your skin captures light in a way that reminds me of quantum probability patterns." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Era stared at him, then laughed. A clear, bright sound that seemed to make the crystals around them vibrate in harmony. "That's the most unusual compliment I've ever received, and the most meaningful." She led him to a window overlooking the crystal city below. "I know this marriage wasn't your choice. It wasn't mine either. But perhaps—" She paused, searching for words. "Perhaps we can make something real from it," Hanwoo finished. "Something beyond politics and treaties." Hera nodded, her gray skin shimmering as she moved. "I'd like that." She turned back to the displays. "Would you like to see my latest project? I'm studying the relationship between crystal harmonics and dark matter." As she explained her theories, Hanwoo watched how her hands moved through the holographic displays, how her eyes lit up with excitement, how her supposedly unattractive gray skin caught and held light in ways that created subtle, beautiful patterns. He realized that the Valerian standard of beauty, their obsession with pearl-like, reflective skin, had blinded them to something extraordinary. "Why don't we continue this discussion over dinner?" he suggested when she finished. "I'd love to hear more about your dark matter theories." Era's smile made the crystals around them pulse with light. "I'd like that very much," she said, and for the first time since the arrangement was made, both of them felt hope for their future together. The headlines flashed across every screen in both worlds. Earth's news channels couldn't stop talking about the diplomatic sacrifice, while Valerian crystal broadcasts shimmered with barely hidden mockery of their gray-skinned princess. Hanwoo watched another report from his office, his jaw tightening as they showed unflattering images of Era. "Turn it off," he told his computer, and the holographic display faded. but he could still hear the whispers from the hallway. Other diplomats discussing his upcoming marriage with a mix of pity and scorn. He had grown tired of their sympathetic looks. A soft chime announced a message from Era. She had sent him her latest research paper on crystal-powered faster-than-light travel. As he read through it, his eyes widened. She had solved problems that had stumped scientists from both worlds for decades. The door slid open, and a reporter from Earth's global news network walked in uninvited. Diplomat Hanwoo, how do you respond to claims that this marriage is a form of cruel punishment? Hanwoo looked up from Era's paper, anger flickering in his eyes. Do you know what I'm reading right now? Princess Era's groundbreaking work on interstellar travel. She's just revolutionized spaceflight theory. But all you want to talk about is how she looks. The reporter blinked, caught off guard. But surely you must admit that by Galarian standards, by any standards, she's brilliant, Hanwoo interrupted. He stood up and projected Era's equations onto the wall. Look at this. She's found a way to use crystal resonance to create stable wormholes. Do you understand what that means? She might have just solved faster-than-light travel. Another chime sounded, this time from a Valerian broadcast seeking comment. Their crystalline camera drone floated in, its facets catching the light. The noble houses are concerned about the dilution of royal bloodlines, the broadcaster's voice chimed. How do you respond? Hanwoo faced the drone directly. Beauty is more than crystalline perfection, he said firmly. Princess Era's work will take both our peoples to the stars. That's the true mark of nobility. Later that day, he found Era in their usual spot in the archives. She was huddled over her work, trying to look smaller, to hide from the world's judgment. Without a word, he placed a small earth plant on her desk, a night-blooming flower that glowed in darkness. What's this? She asked, touching its petals gently. On Earth, we call it a moonflower. Most people ignore it during the day, but at night. He pulled up the blinds, dimming the room. The flower began to emit a soft, beautiful light. At night, it shows its true beauty. Era smiled, her gray skin catching the flower's glow. The nobles called me a stain on the royal lineage today, she said quietly. The nobles are fools, Hanwoo replied. They don't see that you're creating the future while they're clinging to the past. He sat beside her, looking at her latest calculations. Tell me more about how you solved the quantum tunneling problem. As Era explained her work, her confidence returned. Her hands moved gracefully through the holographic displays, her eyes bright with passion. Outside, the media circus continued, but in their quiet corner of the archives, surrounded by the knowledge of two worlds, none of it seemed to matter. Let them talk, Hanwoo said when another news alert chimed. We're going to change everything, you and I, not because of politics or appearance, but because of what we can achieve together. Era's gray skin shimmered with that strange, star-like quality he had grown to admire. Together, she repeated softly, and turned back to their work, plotting a course to the stars while the gossips and nobles remained earthbound in their prejudice. Outside the archive windows, the three moons of Valeria rose, their light catching in the crystal spires, creating rainbows that danced across Era's skin. Hanwoo watched as she worked, seeing not the ugly princess of cruel headlines, but a brilliant mind shaping the future of two worlds. The media could say what they wanted. Some things were beyond their understanding. The great crystal cathedral sparkled in the light of three moons as Hanwoo adjusted his traditional blue hanbok. Through the translucent walls, he could see the protesters gathering. Both humans and Valerians united in their opposition to this union. But their shouts couldn't penetrate the thick crystal walls. Era waited in a separate chamber, wearing a dress that blended earth silk with Valerian crystal weave. When Hanwoo caught a glimpse of her through the crystal patterns, his breath caught. Her gray skin seemed different today, almost luminescent under the cathedral lights. The ceremony began with earth traditions. Hanwoo's parents stepped forward, bowing deeply as they presented Era with a wooden duck, symbolizing loyalty. The Valerian nobles whispered behind their crystal fans, but fell silent when Era accepted the gift with perfect earth customs, her movements graceful and precise. Then came the Valerian rites. Crystal chimes rang through the cathedral as floating arches of pure light formed above them. Hanwu and Era stood beneath these bridges of light, their hands joined. The traditional words of binding were spoken in both languages, echoing off the crystal walls. "Look at her skin," someone whispered from the crowd. Hanwu noticed it too. Era's gray complexion was beginning to pulse with a subtle light, like starlight through clouds. She seemed unaware of the change, focused entirely on their shared vows. Outside, the protesters' chants grew louder. "Stop the abomination. Preserve pure bloodlines." Their voices were a distant thunder through the crystal walls. Hanwu squeezed Era's hands gently as they began the final part of the ceremony, the mixing of crystal dust and earth soil. As they poured the elements together, something extraordinary happened. The mixture began to glow, responding to the increasingly bright pulses coming from Era's skin. The high priest of Valeria paused in his chanting, staring at the phenomenon. The crystal arches above them shimmered with new colors, responding to Era's strange luminescence. Even the protesters outside fell quiet, pressing against the cathedral walls to watch. "Are you all right?" Hanwu whispered to Era, concerned. She nodded, her violet eyes bright. "I feel different, but good." Her gray skin continued to pulse with light, creating patterns that looked like flowing stardust. They completed their vows as planned, but now everyone was watching Era's transformation with wonder. The same nobles who had mocked her gray skin now leaned forward in their seats, crystal fans forgotten in their laps. When Hanwu kissed his bride, the light from her skin briefly intensified, making the crystal cathedral sing with harmonic resonance. The protesters outside had fallen completely silent, their signs lowered, watching in awe through the crystal walls. "I don't understand what's happening," Era whispered as they turned to face their guests, her skin still shimmering with that strange, beautiful light. "Whatever it is," Hanwu replied softly, "you're beautiful. You always were." As they walked down the aisle together, the crystal arches above them pulsed in sync with Era's glowing skin. The cathedral filled with gasps of wonder and confusion. Even the most traditional Valerian nobles couldn't deny that something extraordinary was occurring. Through the crystal walls, they could see the protesters dispersing, their angry signs discarded. Some stayed to watch, pressing their hands against the crystal as if trying to catch some of the mysterious light that now surrounded the bride. The ceremony ended with both Earth and Valerian blessings, but all eyes remained fixed on Era's transforming skin. As they reached the cathedral doors, Hanwu noticed something else. Tiny crystal patterns forming beneath her gray surface, like stars being born in a night sky. "Ready to face them?" he asked, nodding toward the remaining crowd outside. Era stood tall, her gray skin pulsing with inner light. "Together," she said firmly, and they pushed open the crystal doors, stepping out into whatever future awaited them. The 3 moons of Valeria shone down on the couple as they emerged, their light seeming to dance with the strange glow emanating from the bride. Nobody was shouting now. They were all too busy watching in wonder as history unfolded before them. The crystal reception hall buzzed with excitement and confusion as Era's skin continued to pulse with mysterious light. Hanwu stood beside his new wife, watching as the patterns beneath her gray surface grew more intricate with each passing moment. The guests who had arrived ready to mock now stared in wonder. Elder Min, the ancient keeper of Valerian records, burst into the hall clutching a crystal tablet so old it was nearly opaque. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with urgent excitement as he pushed through the crowd toward the royal table. "Your Highness," he called out, his voice trembling. "I found it. In the deepest vaults, in records we'd nearly forgotten." His hand shook as he placed the ancient tablet on the table before them. The tablet flickered to life, displaying text in ancient Valerian script. Era leaned forward, her glowing skin illuminating the ancient words. Her eyes widened as she translated the text aloud. "The gray ones are born when the royal blood runs strongest," she read, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Their dull shells hide the crystal fire within, waiting for the perfect moment to emerge. This is the true mark of the ancient kings and queens." Hanwu watched as more guests gathered around them. The Valerian nobles who had whispered cruel words about Era's appearance now pressed closer, their crystal fans forgotten in their hands. Elder Min activated another section of the tablet, and a holographic image appeared, a figure with gray skin transforming into a being of pure crystal and light. The image looked exactly like what was happening to Era. The last recorded royal metamorphosis was 10 generations ago. Elder Min explained, his voice filled with awe. "We have forgotten. We thought the gray skin was a defect, but it's actually—" He paused, overwhelmed. "A chrysalis," Era finished softly, looking at her hands as new patterns of light danced beneath her skin. The head of the noble houses stepped forward, his pearl-like skin now seeming dull compared to Era's glow. "We have wronged you, princess," he said, bowing deeply. "The ancient blood runs stronger in you than in any of us." Hanwu took Era's hand, feeling it pulse with warmth and energy. "You knew you were different," he said quietly. "That's why you spent so much time in the archives, searching." Era nodded, tears making tracks of crystal light down her cheeks. "I always felt there was something more, something waiting, but I never imagined." More text appeared on the ancient tablet, and Elder Min gasped. "The transformation is triggered by true acceptance," he read. "When one sees beyond the gray shell to the beauty within, the metamorphosis begins." The guests turned to look at Hanwu, understanding dawning on their faces. It was his acceptance, his ability to see past Era's supposed flaws, that had awakened her true nature. Outside the reception hall windows, the 3 moons of Valeria aligned, their light seeming to concentrate on Era. The patterns beneath her skin began to move faster, forming complex crystalline structures. "It's not complete yet," Elder Min said, studying the ancient text. "The full transformation takes time. But when it's done—" He looked at Era with newfound respect. Hanwu squeezed his wife's hand. "You're still you," he said firmly. "No matter what happens next, you're still the brilliant scientist I fell in love with." Era smiled, her violet eyes now containing specks of crystal light. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered. "For really seeing me, before anyone knew the truth." The reception continued around them, but now with a very different atmosphere. The same nobles who had planned to leave early now lingered, watching their princess with wondering eyes. The ancient texts were passed around, translated, studied. Everyone wanted to understand what they had nearly lost through their prejudice. As the moons rose higher, Era's transformation continued slowly but steadily. Hanwu stayed by her side, watching in amazement as the wife everyone had called ugly revealed her true nature, not just beautiful, but extraordinary in ways none of them had imagined. Elder Min spent the rest of the evening digging through more ancient texts, promising to find everything recorded about the royal metamorphosis. But Hanwu noticed that Era seemed more interested in how this discovery might advance their scientific work together. Even now, her mind was on the future, not the past. The crystal ballroom filled with traditional music from both worlds as the wedding celebration continued into the night. Hanwu and Era swayed gently to an earth waltz when it began. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. Era's entire body had started to shine with an intense inner light. The gray skin that had once drawn mockery began to shift and change. It started at her fingertips, spreading slowly up her arms, her outer layer becoming transparent, revealing a structure of pure crystal beneath. Light flowed through these crystal patterns like liquid starlight. The music stopped. Everyone stepped back, forming a circle around the couple. Through the crystal walls, even the few remaining protesters pressed close to watch, their angry signs dropped forgotten to the ground. "Hanwu," Era whispered, her voice carrying a musical chime it hadn't had before. "I feel it happening. I'm not afraid anymore." He held her hands as the transformation continued. The crystal patterns spread across her shoulders, down her chest, following the paths of her veins but replacing them with channels of pure light. Her wedding dress seemed to merge with her changing form, becoming part of the crystalline structure. Elder Min rushed forward with more ancient texts, reading rapidly. The final phase of the royal metamorphosis, a return to the true form of our ancestors. Before we chose to become more like other species, to dull our light, Era's face began to change last. The gray skin turned transparent, revealing a structure of perfect crystal beneath. Her violet eyes became deep pools of light, holding entire galaxies in their depths. When the transformation reached her hair, each strand became a filament of living crystal that floated as if underwater. Light poured from her body in waves, making the crystal walls of the ballroom sing in harmony. The 3 moons of Valeria seemed to shine brighter in response, their light focusing through the crystal ceiling to dance with Era's glow. "You're beautiful," Hanwu said softly, still holding her hands, which now felt like warm crystal against his skin. "But you always were." Era smiled, and her entire form brightened with joy. When she moved, it was like watching light flow through water. The crystal structures within her body created rainbow patterns that shifted with each motion. The Valerian nobles who had once scorned her fell to their knees. Through the windows, the protesters did the same. Nobody had ever seen anything like her. A being of pure crystal and light, more radiant than any Valerian in recorded history. The ancient texts didn't do it justice. Elder Min murmured, his own pearl-like skin seeming dull and artificial in comparison. "This is what we once were, before we chose to change ourselves to fit in with other species." Era turned to face the crowd, her movements creating waves of light that rippled through the air. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the crystal walls resonate. "Our differences aren't flaws," she said. "They're reminders of who we truly are." She reached for Hanwu, and he stepped forward without hesitation. Where their hands met, his skin seemed to catch some of her light, glowing softly at the point of contact. They began to dance again, and the musicians slowly recovered from their awe enough to play. As they moved across the floor, Era's light created patterns in the air around them, telling stories in ancient Valerian script. The crystal walls of the ballroom amplified her radiance, filling the entire city with a soft glow that rivaled the moon's. Outside, the last protesters were leaving, many in tears. Some stopped to bow deeply toward the ballroom. Inside, the celebration had transformed into something more reverent, a recognition that they were witnessing the return of something long lost to their people. Hanwu held his transformed wife close as they danced, unafraid of her radiance. "Does it feel different?" he asked softly. "It feels right," she replied, her voice carrying notes of crystal music. "Like I'm finally who I was always meant to be." She paused, looking into his eyes. "Thank you for seeing me, even when I couldn't see myself." The celebration continued into the night, but it was no longer just a wedding reception. It had become a revelation, a reminder to both humans and Valerians that beauty takes many forms, and sometimes the most extraordinary things come disguised as flaws, waiting for someone wise enough to see their true value. Through it all, Hanwu and Era danced, their 2 forms, one human, one crystalline, moving together in perfect harmony, writing a new chapter in the histories of both their peoples. Years after the wedding that changed 2 worlds, Hanwu and Era worked side by side in their shared laboratory at the New Earth Valeria Science Academy. Her crystalline form cast moving patterns of light across their research equipment, while he typed rapidly at a holographic keyboard, recording their latest breakthrough. "The crystal drive is stable," Era announced, her voice carrying those musical harmonics that still made Hanwu smile. "We've finally done it, sustainable faster than light travel." Their success had come from combining Earth's practical engineering with Valerian crystal technology. But the real breakthrough had been their partnership, their ability to see beyond their differences to the possibilities that lay between their 2 cultures. Students often paused in the hallway outside their lab, watching through the crystal walls as the human scientist and his luminous Valerian wife worked together. Young couples from both species would point to them and whisper about the love that changed everything. But Hanwoo and Era paid little attention to their legendary status. They remained focused on their work, on building bridges between their peoples through science and understanding. Their latest project would allow ships to travel between Earth and Valeria in hours instead of months. "Remember when everyone thought our marriage was a terrible mistake?" Era asked, her crystal form shimming with amusement as she adjusted the experimental drive. "I remember thinking they were all blind," Hanwoo replied, reaching up to touch her crystalline hand. After all these years, her touch still felt like warm starlight against his skin. Their laboratory door chimed, announcing visitors. A young human Valerian couple entered, both looking nervous. The Valerian girl had gray skin, and her human partner held her hand protectively. "We came to ask for your blessing," the girl said softly. "Our families don't understand, but we've seen how love can transform everything." Era's light softened as she looked at the couple. "The greatest transformations," she said gently, "come from being truly seen and accepted for who you are." Hanwoo nodded. "My wife wasn't transformed by magic," he told them. "She was transformed by acceptance, both self-acceptance and the kind that comes from being truly loved." The young couple left with renewed hope, while Hanwoo and Era returned to their work. Through the laboratory windows, they could see the sprawling campus of the Science Academy, where humans and Valerians studied together, sharing knowledge and building a future neither species could have achieved alone. That evening, as the three moons rose over the crystal spires of the city, Hanwoo and Era stood on their balcony. She glowed more softly now, her light pulsing in harmony with his heartbeat, a synchronization they had discovered years ago. "Did you ever imagine we'd come this far?" he asked, watching ships with the new crystal drives testing in the distance. Era's crystalline form shifted colors with her emotions, something Hanwoo had learned to read as clearly as any human expression. "I imagined many things in those days when I hid in the archives," she said, "but nothing as wonderful as this." Below their balcony, more mixed couples walked the academy grounds. The prejudices that had once seemed so insurmountable were fading with each new generation. Their love story had opened a door, showing both worlds that differences could be strengths rather than barriers. "We should finish the drive calculations," Era said finally, her practical nature showing through her radiant form. Hanwoo smiled. "Always the scientist," he teased, but followed her back to their work. That was their real legacy. Not the fairy tale of transformation, but the daily choice to work together, to build something new, to see beauty in difference. As they returned to their calculations, their story continued to spread across both worlds. But the most important part wasn't the magical transformation or the political alliance. It was the simple truth that love could bridge any distance, break any barrier, and reveal beauty in its most unexpected forms. Through the crystal walls of their laboratory, the three moons of Valeria cast their light, creating rainbows that danced between the human scientist and his crystalline wife as they worked to bring their peoples closer together, one discovery at a time.